What if I told you, the moment a narcissist can no longer control a woman, he doesn't just walk away, he rewrites who she is. Suddenly, the same woman he once called kind, pure, and too good for this world becomes crazy, dangerous, even a witch. But why? What really changes? Is it her, or is it the power she finally takes back? In this video, we're going to uncover the hidden truth behind why narcissists label God's empathic women this way, and what it actually reveals about their deepest fears. Because the truth is, when an empathic woman stops begging for love and starts choosing herself, something shifts that a narcissist cannot handle, and that's when the mask slips. Stay with me till the end, because what you're about to understand might completely change how you see yourself or someone in your life. And if you've ever been misunderstood, mislabeled, or made to feel like you were too much, drop a comment saying, "I see it now." And don't forget to subscribe, because this might be the message you didn't know you needed. The loss of control is where everything begins to shift, and for a narcissist, that shift feels like a direct threat to their entire sense of identity. Narcissists don't just enjoy control, they depend on it to feel stable, important, and secure. For a long time, the empathic woman unknowingly feeds this dynamic. She listens, she forgives, she explains, she tries harder, and she keeps showing up with patience even when she is being drained. In that phase, the narcissist feels powerful because her reactions are predictable. He knows how to trigger her emotions, how to pull her back in, and how to keep her orbiting around his needs. But the moment she begins to change, even slightly, everything starts to collapse from his perspective. When she stops reacting the way she used to, when she no longer chases after him for answers or closure, and when she starts choosing her own peace over his approval, it creates a kind of silent chaos that he cannot control. This is where fear enters, even if he never admits it. Her calmness feels unfamiliar. Her distance feels like rejection. Her lack of reaction feels like she is slipping out of his grasp. And because he cannot regulate that feeling internally, he tries to make sense of it by turning her into the problem. Instead of recognizing that she is growing, healing, or simply protecting herself, he labels her as cold, difficult, or even dangerous. The word witch or anything similar becomes a way to explain what he cannot control anymore. It gives him a false sense of power, as if by naming her, he can reduce her strength back into something manageable. But the truth is, nothing about her has become harmful. What has changed is her awareness. She no longer responds to manipulation, she no longer absorbs emotional chaos, and she no longer sacrifices herself to keep the connection alive. That shift breaks the pattern that once gave him control. And to someone who relies on that control, it feels like losing ground, like losing influence, like losing access. So instead of adapting, he resists, he criticizes, he judges, and he creates a narrative where she is the one who has changed too much. In reality, her transformation is not something dark or threatening. It is clarity, it is self-respect. It is the quiet decision to stop abandoning herself just to be understood by someone who never truly tried to understand her in the first place. But for the narcissist, that kind of independence feels like something he cannot reach, cannot predict, and cannot dominate. And anything that exists outside his control quickly becomes something he fears. Emotional independence is one of the most misunderstood transformations, especially in the eyes of a narcissist. In the beginning, when she was deeply empathic, her nature was soft, giving, and endlessly patient. She tried to understand everything, even the behavior that hurt her. She made excuses, gave second chances, and often carried the emotional weight of the relationship on her own shoulders. To the narcissist, this version of her felt safe. It was familiar, predictable, and most importantly, easy to influence. Her kindness became something he could rely on, not to nurture the relationship, but to maintain control over it. As long as she remained in that state, he felt secure, because her focus was always on fixing things rather than questioning them. But emotional independence changes that dynamic completely. It doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't come from anger, it comes from realization. Slowly, she begins to see patterns she once ignored. She starts noticing how much of herself she has been sacrificing just to keep the peace. And with that awareness comes a quiet shift. She no longer feels the need to explain herself endlessly. She no longer rushes to repair what she didn't break. She begins to choose her peace over constant emotional labor. From the outside, this may look like distance, but in reality, it is self-respect taking its place. To the narcissist, however, this shift feels like rebellion. In his mind, she is no longer playing the role he assigned to her. She is no longer as available, as responsive, or as easily influenced as before. Her silence feels like defiance. Her boundaries feel like resistance. And her calm confidence feels like she is challenging his authority, even though she is simply reclaiming her own. Because he is used to a version of her that adapted to him, this new version feels unfamiliar and uncomfortable. Instead of recognizing her growth, he convinces himself that she has changed, often using that word as a criticism rather than an observation. What he fails to understand is that she hasn't changed into something unnatural, she has returned to herself. The empathy is still there, but it is no longer being given without awareness. The kindness still exists, but it is now guided by self-worth. Emotional independence doesn't mean she has become cold or distant. It means she has stopped abandoning herself to keep someone else comfortable. It is a form of awakening, where she finally sees her own value clearly enough to protect it. And that is what unsettles the narcissist the most. Not because she has become difficult, but because she has become unavailable to the patterns that once worked on her. Her independence is not rebellion, it is clarity. But to someone who relied on her emotional dependence, that clarity feels like a quiet refusal to be controlled ever again. Boundaries are a natural and healthy part of any balanced relationship, but to a narcissist, they don't feel normal at all. They feel personal, almost like a direct attack. In the beginning, when she was more open and accommodating, there were very few limits. She said yes more than she said no. She tolerated behavior that crossed her comfort zone, and she often put his needs ahead of her own without even realizing it. That absence of boundaries created a space where the narcissist could move freely, without resistance, without accountability, and without ever having to adjust his behavior. It wasn't just comfortable for him, it became expected. But the moment she begins to set boundaries, everything changes. It might start with something small, like refusing to engage in an argument, or choosing not to respond to disrespect. Then it grows into bigger shifts, saying no without guilt, stepping away from draining conversations, or no longer explaining herself over and over again. These are normal, healthy actions, but to the narcissist, they feel like rejection. He doesn't see them as acts of self-respect. He interprets them as acts of defiance. In his mind, she is no longer cooperating, no longer playing her role, and that creates a sense of discomfort he cannot easily process. Because he lacks the ability to reflect inwardly, He doesn't pause to ask why she is setting these boundaries. Instead, he reacts emotionally. He may accuse her of being selfish, cold, or dramatic. He may say she has changed or that she is overreacting. What he is really reacting to is the loss of access, the loss of the version of her that once allowed everything without resistance. Boundaries interrupt that access. They introduce limits where there were none before, and for someone used to having control, those limits feel suffocating. When he cannot break those boundaries, he often shifts into another strategy, demonizing her. He may paint her as the problem, not because she has done anything wrong, but because it helps him protect his own image. By labeling her as difficult or unreasonable, he avoids confronting the reality that her boundaries are a response to his behavior. It becomes easier for him to believe that she is the issue rather than accept that he no longer has the same influence over her. What he doesn't understand is that boundaries are not meant to punish. They are meant to protect. They are a sign that she has learned from her experiences, that she values her energy, and that she is no longer willing to be placed in situations that harm her. Her no is not an attack, it is a decision. Her distance is not cruelty, it is clarity. And her refusal to be manipulated is not rebellion, it is growth. But to a narcissist, who once thrived in a space without limits, those same boundaries feel like walls closing in, reminding him that the control he once had no longer exists. Her intuition was always there, quietly guiding her, picking up on tones, patterns, and unspoken truths that others might miss. As an empathic woman, she felt things deeply, often sensing shifts in energy before anything was said out loud. But in the past, she didn't always trust that inner voice. She questioned it, doubted it, and sometimes even silenced it in order to keep the peace. She gave people the benefit of the doubt, ignored small warning signs, and convinced herself that her feelings might be too much or not accurate. That hesitation made her predictable to a narcissist, because even when she sensed something was wrong, she would stay, explain, and try to fix it instead of acting on what she felt. But once she awakens, that changes completely. Her intuition becomes something she listens to, not something she debates with. She starts to recognize patterns clearly, without needing constant proof. The same behaviors that once confused her now stand out immediately. She no longer overlooks inconsistencies, mixed signals, or subtle manipulation. Instead of explaining away red flags, she acknowledges them for what they are. This shift doesn't make her cold, it makes her clear. It allows her to respond with awareness instead of emotional impulse. To a narcissist, this transformation feels unsettling. Before, he could rely on her doubt. He knew she might question herself, give him another chance, or stay longer than she should. But now, she reacts differently. Sometimes she doesn't react at all. She observes, processes, and then makes a quiet decision that doesn't require his approval. That lack of predictability is what disturbs him the most. He can no longer read her the way he used to. He cannot easily anticipate her responses or guide the situation in his favor. The strategies that once worked suddenly fall flat, and that creates a sense of instability he cannot control. Her silence becomes harder to interpret. Her calmness feels distant. Her decisions seem final. And because he cannot access her thoughts or influence her emotions the way he once did, he starts to feel like he is losing his grip. To him, it feels like she has become unreadable, almost like there is a part of her he cannot reach anymore. But in reality, she hasn't become closed off. She has become aligned with herself. She is no longer looking outward for validation or direction. She is listening inward. That inner alignment is what makes her powerful. She doesn't need to argue to prove a point. And she doesn't need to explain every choice she makes. Her intuition gives her a quiet confidence that doesn't depend on anyone else's understanding. And for a narcissist, who depends on reading, influencing, and controlling emotional responses, that kind of self-trust feels like a wall he cannot break through. What he once saw as softness has now become strength, and what he once understood has now become something completely out of his reach. Projection is one of the most powerful defense mechanisms a narcissist uses, and it often becomes most visible when he begins to lose control of the narrative. Beneath the surface, narcissists carry a deep layer of insecurity, unresolved guilt, and patterns of manipulation they rarely acknowledge, even to themselves. Facing those parts would require honesty and self-reflection, and that is something they actively avoid. Instead, they find a way to push those uncomfortable truths outward, placing them onto someone else. Most often, the empathic woman who once stood closest to them. She becomes the mirror they don't want to look into, so they try to distort that mirror until it reflects something easier to reject. In the beginning, when she is still open and trying to understand, she may absorb some of these projections without realizing it. She might question herself, wonder if she really is too emotional, too sensitive, or somehow at fault for the imbalance in the relationship. But as she becomes more aware, she starts to see the pattern more clearly. The accusations don't match her actions. The labels don't reflect who she truly is. What once confused her begins to make sense, and she realizes that what is being thrown at her does not belong to her. For the narcissist, however, this projection serves a purpose. By calling her toxic, he avoids admitting his own harmful behavior. By labeling her crazy, he dismisses her clarity and invalidates her experience. And by using extreme words like witch, or anything that suggests something unnatural or threatening, he creates distance between her true self and the image he wants others, and even himself, to believe. It becomes a way to protect his ego, to maintain control over the story, and to escape accountability without ever having to confront his own actions. What makes this even more intense is that her growth threatens that illusion. As she becomes more grounded and self-aware, she stops reacting to these labels in the same way. She no longer feels the need to defend herself against accusations that don't align with her reality. Her calmness in the face of those projections only frustrates him more, because it removes the emotional reaction he once relied on. Without that reaction, his words lose their power, and the projection begins to fall apart. In truth, the darkness he tries to place on her was never hers to carry. It comes from his own unhealed patterns, his own avoidance, and his own inability to face what lies within. But rather than confront it, he attempts to shift it onto someone who once cared deeply enough to take responsibility for everything. The difference now is that she no longer accepts that role. She sees the projection for what it is, a reflection of him, not her. And in that awareness, she reclaims her identity, no longer defined by the labels placed on her, but by the truth she has come to understand about herself. Her silence is not sudden, it is the result of years of giving, explaining, and trying to fix things that were never hers to fix. There was a time when she felt compelled to justify herself, to answer every accusation, to clarify every misunderstanding. She overgave, stretched herself thin, and placed the needs of others above her own, hoping that by being endlessly patient and understanding, she could maintain peace or earn the recognition and love she deserved. To a narcissist, this behavior was predictable and easy to manipulate. They thrived on her explanations because they kept her entangled in their web of control, guilt, and obligation. Every time she spoke, every time she tried to reason with him, it reinforced the dynamic he depended on. But over time, something shifted. She realized that no amount of explaining or overgiving could change the way he operated. No amount of patience could make him see her worth or understand her needs. She saw clearly that her energy, her time, and her emotions were being drained in a pattern that served him, not her. That realization was quiet at first, almost imperceptible, but it began to grow. She started to step back, to pause before responding, and to reconsider why she felt compelled to justify her every thought and feeling. Slowly, she began to embrace the idea that her presence alone, without constant explanation or approval, was enough. This is where the power of silence emerges. When she stops over-explaining, stops overgiving, and stops trying to fix everything, her absence from the chaos becomes her strength. Walking away in silence does not mean she is cold or uncaring. It means she has chosen herself over the drama and manipulation that once consumed her. She has learned that sometimes the most powerful message is not spoken. It is shown through boundaries, calmness, and refusal to engage in unnecessary conflict. Her quiet presence becomes a force the narcissist cannot predict or control, because it no longer reacts to his attempts to provoke, confuse, or manipulate. To the narcissist, this silence is terrifying. They are accustomed to instant reactions, to emotional leverage, to constant opportunities for validation or control. When she no longer responds, they feel a loss of influence they cannot comprehend. Her quiet strength seems unnatural, intimidating, almost threatening, because it operates outside the rules he has always depended on. He interprets her peace as power, and that scares him more than any argument ever could. Her silence is the culmination of growth, awareness, and self-respect. It is the manifestation of understanding her own worth and refusing to allow anyone, no matter how manipulative, to dictate her emotions or actions. Where once she might have tried to fix him or the relationship, now she simply stands in her own truth, unshaken and unapologetic. That silence is her shield, her voice, and her power all at once, and it is something a narcissist can never predict or control. Spiritual growth is a quiet, subtle transformation, but to a narcissist, it feels explosive. For an empathic woman, connecting deeply with her faith, her purpose, or God isn't about showing off or seeking validation. It's about aligning with her own truth and the higher guidance that strengthens her soul. It begins in small ways. She starts noticing her thoughts, reflecting on her actions, and paying attention to the energy she allows around her. She starts seeking clarity over chaos, peace over constant drama, and purpose over temporary distractions. And in that process, she discovers an inner strength she didn't know she possessed, a strength that cannot be bought, manipulated, or borrowed. To someone who has spent their life relying on control, manipulation, and ego-driven tactics, this kind of growth is deeply unsettling. Narcissists thrive on predictability. They feel secure when people around them can be influenced, swayed, and led by their whims. They are masters at reading emotional cues, pushing buttons, and finding weaknesses to exploit. But when an empathic woman grows spiritually, she becomes less readable. Her reactions are guided not by fear or need for approval, but by alignment with her faith and her own values. Suddenly, the strategies he relied on no longer work. The manipulations that once drew tears, confusion, or obedience now bounce off an invisible shield, built from her newfound clarity. Spiritual growth also brings awareness. She starts to see patterns not just in him, but in life. She recognizes the cycles of toxicity she once tolerated. She understands the red flags she ignored for too long. She identifies the moments when she compromised herself for someone who could never truly meet her needs. And because her focus is on what is true, holy, and aligned with God or her higher purpose, she begins to make decisions that are firm and unshakable. Every choice she makes is intentional, guided by principles rather than emotions that can be manipulated. For the narcissist, this is terrifying. They are used to people who bend, who react, who offer leverage. They are comfortable in relationships where the other person is constantly seeking approval, justification, or emotional connection on their terms. But spiritual growth removes those hooks. When she prays, meditates, or simply aligns herself with a higher purpose, she is no longer dependent on his validation. She doesn't need to argue to be heard. She doesn't need to justify her feelings. And she no longer tolerates behavior that undermines her peace. To a narcissist, this feels unnatural. It is intimidating because it operates outside the sphere of their control. The more she grows spiritually, the more she embodies qualities that narcissists both envy and fear. Patience becomes her power. Calmness becomes her shield. Discernment becomes her weapon. She learns to listen more, react less, and walk away when something does not serve her higher good. Every action, every word, every pause becomes intentional rather than reactive. She is no longer just giving from a place of fear or hope for love. She is giving from a place of alignment, where her energy is sacred and protected. Narcissists cannot relate to this because they lack inner stability. Their lives are driven by ego, desire for control, and the constant need for external validation. They have not learned to connect with anything larger than themselves, to find peace or purpose beyond immediate gratification, or to recognize the value of aligning with something holy or divine. When someone operates from that place, it challenges everything they know about relationships, influence, and power. Suddenly, the rules of engagement no longer apply. They cannot predict her actions, bend her emotions, or trap her in their games. And in their minds, that unpredictability translates to threat. This intimidation often manifests in projection and attempts to control even after her growth is visible. He may accuse her of being distant, cold, or self-righteous. He may belittle her beliefs or mock her values, trying desperately to destabilize the spiritual foundation she has built. But these attempts rarely succeed. Spiritual growth equips her with the tools to maintain clarity and focus, even in the presence of chaos. Her faith and alignment act like a compass, keeping her steady when he attempts to shake her world. Moreover, spiritual growth is often paired with self-love and self-respect. She begins to honor her boundaries, her energy, and her time. She recognizes that she is not responsible for carrying the weight of his insecurities or absorbing the consequences of his manipulation. This awareness removes the leverage he once had. Her energy becomes selective. She invests only in what aligns with her higher purpose, and that discernment is something a narcissist cannot manipulate. The more he tries, the more obvious it becomes that his tactics no longer hold sway. In essence, spiritual growth is a form of empowerment that narcissists cannot tolerate. It makes the empathic woman untouchable, not because she is invincible, but because she is anchored in something deeper than his reach. Every prayer, every act of reflection, every step toward her purpose strengthens her presence and reduces his influence. Where she once relied on his recognition or approval, she now stands firm in alignment with God, the universe, or her own higher truth. And that is what intimidates him most, the realization that she no longer needs him to define her worth, to dictate her emotions, or to control her reality. The beauty of this growth is that it is quiet yet undeniable. It does not need to be loud to be felt. Her peace radiates, her clarity shines, and her strength becomes visible in ways he cannot comprehend or counteract. He may call her names, attempt manipulation, or spread fear, but none of it touches the foundation she has built. In truth, the more he reacts, the more obvious it becomes that her growth is real, powerful, and permanent. Spiritual growth is not just a change in belief. It is a transformation that reshapes how she lives, interacts, and protects herself, making her a force that a narcissist can never fully understand or control. And that is why spiritual growth intimidates them so profoundly. It is not a threat to her, it is a threat to their illusion of power. She has tapped into something he cannot reach, cannot predict, and cannot dominate. She has aligned herself with a truth larger than manipulation, larger than control, and larger than fear. And in that alignment, she is untouchable, unshakable, and free in a way that terrifies the narcissist more than any confrontation ever could. When she stops feeding their ego, everything the narcissist relied on begins to crumble. Narcissists depend on constant validation. It is the air they breathe, the fuel that keeps their fragile sense of self alive. For years, she may have unknowingly provided this validation, praising him, defending him, excusing his behavior, and seeking his approval in every possible way. Each compliment, each attempt to keep the peace, each moment spent trying to anticipate his needs reinforced his sense of superiority. He didn't see it as manipulation on her part. He simply expected it as normal. Her compliance, her attention, her emotional labor, all of it was a source of power for him. But the moment she stops, the balance shifts. She no longer gives unsolicited praise. She no longer chases him to make him feel better. She stops explaining herself endlessly, and she refuses to be the caretaker of his ego. To a narcissist, this is not simply independence, it is a challenge to his very identity. His sense of superiority begins to feel threatened because the validation he once counted on is no longer guaranteed. He feels exposed, vulnerable, and even small, and because he cannot process these feelings in a healthy way, he reacts defensively. Instead of admitting that he misses the constant validation, he flips the narrative. He tells himself, and sometimes others, that she is the problem. Her refusal to cater to his ego becomes proof of her supposed coldness, selfishness, or unreasonableness. He paints her as difficult or ungrateful, all while ignoring the fact that he depended on her compliance for his own comfort and sense of self. By blaming her, he protects his fragile identity from facing the uncomfortable truth that her withdrawal of validation is not an attack. It is a reflection of her own growth and self-respect. What he fails to understand is that her actions are not cruel or vengeful. She isn't trying to hurt him. She is reclaiming her power. She is no longer allowing someone else's ego to dictate her worth or her behavior. Every time she refuses to feed him, she reinforces her boundaries, her autonomy, and her clarity. She is showing him that her love, attention, and respect are not unlimited commodities to be consumed at his convenience. They are her own, and she chooses how and when to give them. This refusal to participate in his ego games is both liberating for her and terrifying for him. It exposes the fragile foundations on which his confidence and control were built. Her independence and self, possession make her unpredictable, and that unpredictability is a kind of power he cannot anticipate or influence. What he once thought of as loyalty or submission is now replaced by conscious choice, and that awareness is something a narcissist cannot tolerate. In the end, her refusal to feed his ego is a declaration of her worth. It is a silent but unmistakable message that she no longer exists to serve someone else's emotional needs at the expense of her own. And while he may try to vilify her for it, the reality is that she has simply stepped into her truth, a truth that is unshakable, unapologetic, and entirely beyond his control. Her transformation is subtle at first, but its effects are profound. When she was fully empathic, she tolerated behaviors that others would never have accepted. She gave second chances when it wasn't deserved, forgave mistakes that repeated themselves, and often carried emotional burdens that were not hers to bear. She explained away cruelty, justified selfishness, and overlooked manipulation because she believed in the good in people and held herself responsible for keeping peace. In her empathic state, she tried to fix everything, to understand everything, and to make everyone else comfortable, often at her own expense. The narcissist thrived in this dynamic. Her patience, her selflessness, and her desire to see the best in him made it easy for him to operate without accountability. His actions, which would have been glaringly obvious to others, were masked by her tolerance. In essence, she became a buffer, softening the edges of his behavior and protecting him from the light of scrutiny. But transformation changes everything. Once she awakens, the tolerance that concealed his patterns disappears. Her awareness sharpens, and suddenly behaviors that were once invisible or excused become impossible to ignore. She starts recognizing manipulation, deceit, and emotional exploitation. She begins to see when he gaslights her, when he exaggerates, when he twists facts to serve his narrative. She notices the repeated cycles of blame, control, and selfishness that were always there, but once seemed subtle or manageable. This clarity doesn't come from anger, it comes from understanding her worth, establishing boundaries, and refusing to allow her energy to be drained by someone who cannot respect her. The impact of her transformation is not limited to her own perspective. As she begins to hold herself accountable for her peace and choices, others start noticing the shift as well. Friends, family, colleagues, even casual observers begin to see the patterns that were previously hidden. They see how she was treated, how she responded, and how she now stands firmly in her boundaries. Her change illuminates the contrast between who she was expected to be and who she has become. Suddenly, the narcissist's actions, which were once hidden behind her tolerance and compliance, are now obvious. The behaviors that he counted on her to normalize are visible in stark relief. This exposure is profoundly threatening to the narcissist. He is used to operating in the shadows, manipulating situations in ways that remain largely unseen or unquestioned. His sense of control depends on remaining unexamined, and when the light of her transformation shines on his behavior, it disrupts the carefully constructed illusions he relies on. He becomes uncomfortable, defensive, and often angry. The very actions he considered harmless or inconsequential are suddenly highlighted, reflected in her confidence, her boundaries, and the respect she commands for herself. Others may see it too, and that realization adds another layer of threat. He knows that if her truth becomes fully recognized, his carefully maintained persona could crumble. The narcissist rarely admits this threat openly. Instead, he reacts with strategies designed to discredit her. He spreads rumors, manipulates perceptions, and crafts narratives that cast her as unreasonable, dramatic, or unstable. By attempting to turn others against her, he hopes to regain control over the story and obscure the truth that her transformation has revealed. He may accuse her of changing too much, of being difficult, or of being vindictive, all while ignoring the fact that her actions are rooted in self-preservation and self-awareness. The attempts to discredit her are less about her behavior and more about protecting his fragile sense of superiority. Her transformation exposes a fundamental truth. The problem was never her. It was him, and the patterns he relied on that were harmful and unacceptable. The narcissist, unable to process this, projects blame, labels her as the issue, and spins a false narrative to maintain the illusion of control. But her awareness is resilient. She does not need to defend herself endlessly. She does not need to justify her growth or prove her perspective. Every act of self-respect, every boundary she maintains, and every decision she makes to protect her peace serves as living proof of her transformation. The more she evolves, the more obvious his flaws become, and that visibility intensifies his insecurity. He cannot mask his manipulations behind her compliance anymore, and every attempt to gaslight or manipulate meets resistance. She no longer absorbs his chaos or validates his distorted reality. Her clarity makes her unpredictable in ways he cannot anticipate or control. He begins to feel powerless in situations where he once wielded influence effortlessly, and that loss of power can drive him to desperate attempts to maintain authority through lies, intimidation, or attempts to undermine her credibility. Ultimately, her transformation is not about him, it is about her. It is about reclaiming the self she lost in trying to accommodate someone who could never meet her needs. Her awareness, her boundaries, and her inner strength shine a light on everything he hoped to keep hidden. But this exposure is a natural byproduct of her awakening. She does not need to prove anything. She simply exists in her truth, and that presence is enough to reveal the patterns he relied on for control. In the end, this exposure is liberating. It allows her to step fully into her power, live authentically, and create relationships and spaces where respect, honesty, and mutual care are the norm. For the narcissist, her transformation is uncomfortable, intimidating, and threatening. But for her, it is freedom. It is proof that she no longer tolerates what diminishes her, and that she will no longer hide or explain away behaviors that undermine her worth. Her transformation exposes the truth, illuminates the patterns, and most importantly, protects her from being diminished ever again. It is not revenge, it is not malice, it is simply awareness, self-respect, and the undeniable force of a woman who has reclaimed herself. The narcissist may try to discredit her, but the truth of her transformation is visible to everyone who is willing to see it, and that truth cannot be manipulated, silenced, or erased. When a narcissist calls a woman a witch, it is rarely about her actions, her intentions, or who she truly is. The label is never a reflection of her character. It is a reflection of his fear, confusion, and desperate need to regain control. For years he thrived in a dynamic where her emotions, reactions, and energy were predictable. He knew which words would elicit a response, which silences could be manipulated, and which insecurities could be exploited. He relied on her empathy, her patience, and her selflessness to maintain power over the narrative. But the moment she awakens, when she begins to reclaim herself, recognize her worth, and protect her boundaries, the control he once held begins to slip through his fingers. And this loss of control terrifies him. because everything he has built his sense of self around depends on predictability and influence. The word, which, is a simple, yet effective tool in his arsenal. It is a way to externalize the fear he cannot understand. It is easier for him to demonize her than to face the reality that she has grown beyond his reach. He cannot manipulate her like he once did. Her reactions are no longer available for his amusement, validation, or ego boost. Her silence, her boundaries, and her clarity now operate according to her own principles, not his demands. And to him, this is incomprehensible. He cannot fathom that a woman could simply choose herself, live with purpose, and exist independently of his approval. To a narcissist, that kind of self-possession is unnatural, even threatening. Calling her a witch serves multiple purposes for him. First, it allows him to maintain a narrative in which he is the victim, the rational one, or the one being challenged unfairly. If he can convince others, or even himself, that she is irrational, manipulative, or dangerous, he doesn't have to confront the uncomfortable truth that her strength, clarity, and self-respect are what he fears most. Second, it gives him a false sense of control. By labeling her, he attempts to contain her power within a box that he can define. He cannot influence her, so he tries to redefine her in terms he can tolerate. And third, it allows him to preserve his ego. Accepting that she has evolved beyond his reach would require acknowledging his own limitations, and narcissists are rarely capable of that level of self-reflection. In reality, what she embodies is not something sinister or threatening. It is power in its purest form. She has discovered her own voice, her own values, and her own boundaries. She no longer seeks approval, validation, or permission to exist fully. Her choices are intentional, her emotions are protected, and her energy is sacred. She has become the architect of her own life, and in doing so, she operates outside of the narcissist's control. This independence is not rebellion, it is alignment. It is self-respect, clarity, and empowerment. And because he cannot comprehend or manipulate it, he tries to diminish it with labels and accusations. The irony is that the label, witch, often comes from projection. The qualities he attributes to her, the power, the influence, the independence, are exactly the qualities he lacks within himself. He is threatened not by who she is, but by the mirror she holds up to him. In her confidence and self-possession, he sees the contrast to his own insecurities, his reliance on manipulation, and his inability to cultivate inner stability. By casting her as something unnatural or dangerous, he tries to externalize his fear and preserve the illusion of superiority. He cannot admit that her strength exposes his weakness, so he deflects by naming her the problem. This labeling also functions as a tool of social manipulation. He may attempt to tarnish her reputation in the eyes of friends, family, or colleagues, hoping that others will see her through his distorted lens. He wants to isolate her, to make her seem unpredictable, irrational, or threatening so that her influence is diminished. But no matter how loud his accusations, they cannot erase her truth. Her power is rooted in authenticity, alignment, and self-respect, qualities that cannot be manufactured or undermined by name-calling. The more he tries to define her with fear-based labels, the more obvious it becomes that she operates from a place he cannot touch. What makes this dynamic particularly powerful is that the narcissist's reaction is often transparent. His accusations, his fear, and his attempts to control are clues, revealing exactly what he cannot tolerate: a woman who refuses to be diminished, silenced, or manipulated. Her clarity exposes his dependence on control, his fragility, and the limits of his power. By calling her a witch, he is admitting, without realizing it, that her strength terrifies him and that her independence undermines his illusions of authority. In truth, this label is a compliment disguised as criticism. It is an acknowledgement of the qualities he cannot replicate: self-awareness, confidence, discernment, and alignment with one's purpose. She is powerful, intentional, and unshakable, and these are the very traits that make her untouchable to someone who thrives on influence and manipulation. He fears her not because she is dangerous. He fears her because she exists fully, freely, and independently of his control. Ultimately, the word witch is meaningless when faced with her reality. It cannot define her, control her, or diminish the truth of her transformation. What it does reveal, however, is his fear, his inadequacy, and his inability to cope with power that exists outside of his reach. She is not a label. She is a force of clarity, strength, and self-respect that cannot be manipulated, silenced, or contained. And that, more than anything, terrifies the narcissist. In the complex dance between an empathic woman and a narcissist, one truth emerges more clearly than any label or accusation. The transformation of the empath is the ultimate revelation of power that the narcissist cannot control. For years, she may have operated in a space of quiet compassion, of selfless giving, and of emotional patience that few could understand. Her empathy was not weakness, it was a deeply ingrained sensitivity that allowed her to perceive the emotions, needs, and vulnerabilities of those around her. But in that sensitivity lay a double-edged sword. While it drew connection and understanding from those who respected it, it also became a tool for manipulation in the hands of someone who lacked empathy themselves. Narcissists thrive in the presence of those who overgive, who excuse behaviors that should never be excused, and who constantly seek harmony at the expense of their own well-being. In such dynamics, the empathic woman becomes both a mirror and a buffer, reflecting the narcissist's insecurities, while absorbing the repercussions of his unchecked ego. The awakening of an empathic woman is a profound shift. This is not merely a change in behavior, it is a recalibration of her entire existence, rooted in self-respect, awareness, and alignment with a higher purpose, be it faith, spiritual guidance, or personal clarity. The transformation begins internally. She starts recognizing the patterns she once tolerated, the manipulations she once excused, and the emotional exhaustion she carried as though it were her duty. She begins to see her own energy as sacred, her boundaries as essential, and her peace as non-negotiable. Once that understanding takes root, it manifests externally in every aspect of her life. She walks differently, speaks differently, and most importantly, she interacts differently with herself and with those who once held power over her emotional world. For the narcissist, this transformation is terrifying. His sense of control, which once relied heavily on predictability, manipulation, and access to her emotions, is now rendered ineffective. Her reactions are no longer predictable. She no longer over-explains, overgives, or seeks his approval. She refuses to feed his ego, and in doing so, she deprives him of the validation he depends on for a sense of self-worth. To him, the woman who once seemed endlessly pliable now operates according to her own principles, and that autonomy is a mirror he cannot bear to confront. It threatens not just his control, but his entire self-concept, which has always been built on dominance, influence, and the assumption that others will bend to his narrative. Labels like witch, toxic, or crazy are merely manifestations of this fear. They are not reflective of her true nature. Rather, they are a narcissist's attempt to frame the narrative in terms he can understand and manipulate. Calling her a witch is not a critique of her character, it is an admission of his own powerlessness. He cannot control her, cannot predict her, and cannot diminish her without confronting the reality that she exists beyond his influence. In that sense, the accusation is a paradoxical compliment. It acknowledges the very qualities he lacks: strength, clarity, independence, and alignment with a higher truth. Her spiritual and emotional growth amplifies this effect. When an empath connects with faith, divine purpose, or inner alignment, she taps into a well of resilience that no narcissist can manipulate. Her strength does not come from confrontation or vengeance. It comes from internal clarity, intentional action, and alignment with values that transcend the narcissist's understanding. Every boundary she sets, every decision she makes, and every moment of silence she maintains is an assertion of power that is untouchable, undeniable, and incomprehensible to someone accustomed to emotional puppetry. Her peace becomes a force field that reflects manipulation, exposing it not only to her, but also to anyone who witnesses the dynamic. In practical terms, the narcissist's response is predictable yet revealing. Unable to control her, he may attempt to project blame, spread false narratives, or discredit her in the eyes of others. He seeks to turn perception into leverage, hoping to maintain the illusion of power even as his actual influence diminishes. But her transformation is resilient. It cannot be erased, diminished, or undermined by his fear-based tactics. Every act of projection, every accusation, and every manipulation only highlights the truth she embodies. She is independent, self-aware, and aligned with a power larger than his understanding. The concept of calling a woman a witch takes on profound meaning in this context. Historically, the term was used to demonize women who exhibited power, knowledge, or independence that threatened the established order. In the modern narcissistic dynamic, the label serves a similar psychological function. It is a defense mechanism, a tool to externalize fear, and a projection of inadequacy. The narcissist cannot tolerate her clarity, her intuition, or her autonomy, so he weaponizes words to create an illusion of threat. Yet, these labels are hollow. They do not define her, they define his fear. And every time he uses them, he inadvertently illuminates the very qualities that make her untouchable: her self-respect, her boundaries, her intuition, and her alignment with truth and purpose. At the core, the empathic woman's transformation is a lesson in reclaiming power. It demonstrates that true influence does not come from manipulation, coercion, or control. It comes from clarity, self-respect, and intentional living. By refusing to participate in the narcissist's ego-driven games, she undermines his tactics without confrontation. By maintaining her boundaries, she preserves her energy and peace. By trusting her intuition and aligning with a higher purpose, she operates in a space the narcissist cannot penetrate. Her power is quiet yet undeniable, subtle yet transformative, and the more he tries to discredit it, the more evident it becomes. Ultimately, the story of the empathic woman and the narcissist is a story of awakening, empowerment, and exposure. It is not about defeating him, it is about transcending his influence. The label witch is meaningless in the face of her clarity. The accusations are hollow against the weight of her truth. The attempts to control her are futile against her alignment with purpose, faith, and self-respect. Her transformation exposes the narcissist not through confrontation but through presence. Every choice she makes, every boundary she maintains, and every moment she walks in her power reveals his patterns, his insecurities, and the limits of his control.